It is good to be together. Let me start first by saying a thank you. If we could give a round of applause to Juliana Walsh and Kevin O'Connell, who had the amazing music. They're back there. They are partners of ours from the West Suburban YMCA, and they do all sorts of good things throughout the city. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Juliana. Couple things that I want to say as we get started. First of all, thank you for being here. This is really quite incredible. I think it is a testament to a couple things. First of all, how much people love this city, how deeply they care about the future. I would also say it was a bit of a leap of faith for many of you that we would actually listen, that Russ Preston and the principal group would hear your voices, and I hope you continue to believe that. I do. I would also say that I'm grateful to all of you for the respect that you've been showing to each other during this process. We are all neighbors in this city and partners in its future, and there has been, I think, great generosity among people believing that people have good intentions and are looking hard to see what is possible and what is doable and what we want to do together. A special thank you to the Newtonville Area Council who, long before this process started formally, they were already looking hard at the future of Washington Street, and during this process, they worked simultaneously to try to reach out to people and hear their voices, so thank you to them. We have a whole slew of city councilors here, and I'm going to try to name them, but I'm going to miss somebody. So I'm actually going to suggest, if you're a city councilor, kind of not only stand up, but raise your hand. I'm just going to go around and acknowledge you. So we've got a stand up, if you would. Councilor Lyle Baker, Andrea Kelly, Becky Grossman, Deb Crossley, Emily Norton, Barbara Brussel Glazer, Jake Auchincloss, Rick Lipboff, Josh Krinsman, Lenny Gentile, Susan Albright, Andrea Downs. They are, did I miss anybody? Becky Walker Grossman, thank you. You can tell by how many are here tonight how deep and wide their interest is in this, and they too are our partners as we try to decide what to do with Washington Street. To Russ Preston and the principal group, a thank you to them. They brought a team with quite a wide variety of expertise to us here in Newton, and I'm grateful. They have building experts, financial experts, experts in art and culture, experts in urban planning, fiscal analysis, transportation. They brought that together along with a lot of time and experience that they've spent in other cities and towns, but they combined that with listening to what is so unique, not only about Newton writ large, but the individual areas along Washington Street. This is not a homogeneous corridor by any means, and they listened hard. Thank you. One of the things in particular that I think all of us will see tonight is that they are going to help us struggle. The struggle is that many of us want lots of things out of Washington Street, and sometimes that means, sorry, I'm being waved to. You okay? Making some choices, and they're going to try and make those choices really clear to us so that if we want 50 to 100 to 150 million dollars to fix the accessibility and the frequency of the commuter rail stations, our 3 stations, and given I know how tight the city budget is, if we can't self-fund it and we can't count on the MBTA to fund it, what does that mean, and do we want what that future looks like, or are we going to have to grit our teeth and say that we'd rather stick with the current commuter rail situation, which is pretty lousy. Another thank you to, there are some individuals here on all sorts of boards. I've seen people from the ZBA, from the Planning Board, from the Economic Development Commission, from Green Newton, from the Chamber. Thank you for those interest groups and all the time that you give. And a last one, to the people who work for the City of Newton. If you work for the City of Newton, can you raise your hand for a sec? So there are lots of people here who work for the City of Newton. They care deeply about this city, and they are working really hard to help us with its future. I'm very grateful to them. And while this seems like a really big night tonight, let me just tell you what this week was like. On Monday night, James and Rachel in our planning department delivered to our zoning and planning committee a complete redraft of our zoning ordinance. Last night, there were 65 people plus over at City Hall getting started on a climate action plan. There were another 65 or 70 people over at the senior center trying to sort out what a community center and senior center can look like. Tonight we're here. Tomorrow, 40 of us from the city are gathering at the Emergency Operations Center. It's everybody from the superintendent to all the police chief, the fire chief, our Parks and Rec folks, our DPW folks. We're doing a tabletop exercise, and I can't reveal what it is, but a disaster hits Newton, and we're spending 8 to 4 o'clock as the disaster, frankly, gets worse and worse, and training on that. That's what a week is like in the city of Newton. So I'm grateful to so many people here, and with that, I'm going to hand it off to Barney Heath, who deserves a special thank you. He's been working really hard. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome. Thank you. My remarks will be brief. It's tough to follow the mayor because she's very well versed in planning stuff. So I'm going to kind of run through what tonight's program is and then turn it over to Russ. And then Lily's going to close after his presentation with kind of what to expect. So if you'll indulge me, I'm wearing my Red Sox tie. So on behalf of the city's planning team and our consultant, the principal group, I'd like to set the stage as to tonight's program and what happens from here. But before I do that, I want to spend a little bit on process. So why are we here? The mayor's identified Washington Street, particularly the stretch between Craft Street and West Newton, as an area that deserves our immediate attention. It has been and remains the subject of development interest, and such interest remains high. Rather than remain in a reactive mode, the mayor supports the idea of the city clearly and demonstratively, through detailed zoning, regulating what it would like to see on Washington Street in the future. That word future is really important this evening. Tonight you're going to see images and ideas for Washington Street that are envisioned from now to 20 years or more from now. So I think when you have a chance, and you will, to see all of the different areas on Washington Street, it's quite striking, but understand this is over a 20-year time period, because part of this is vision and part of this is zoning. How does the city arrive at this vision and associated zoning? So there are a lot of steps involved. First, there was an extensive community input aspect. We had an entire public design week back in June that some of you were at and got really good input. We had various online opportunity in the past, and that will continue. And Lily will talk about how you can avail yourself of that. We're being videotaped this evening, and that will be available as well for folks that weren't here tonight. We're also going to hold office hours for folks that want to come in and do kind of one-on-one stuff. We'll talk about that. Second, our planning team, which includes the principal group, will distill all of the feedback, apply its best professional expertise to develop a final vision plan and detailed zoning to present to the City Council. That'll probably happen in the April-May timeframe. We do anticipate that to be in April of next year. And I'm on page 2, which is a good thing for everybody. Who's the principal group? The principal group is a planning and design firm based out of Boston. They specialize in working with New England communities looking, like Newton is, to establish master plans and visions, and importantly, they have the expertise to develop associated zoning to achieve those desired outcomes. The City of Newton hired Principal Group, led by Russ Preston, to work in conjunction with the Newton Planning Department to develop a vision for Washington Street. So what is tonight about? Tonight is about showing possible physical outcomes if certain segments of Washington Street were to be redeveloped under various zoning scenarios. And Russ will get into that. Russ will explain the various nuances that are at play which influence the kind of development one might see. It's important to understand that the examples shown are just illustrations designed to show what might result from choices Newton makes under zoning, and importantly, how parking greatly influences those outcomes. So, in terms of tonight, you'll hear from Russ in a moment. Then after his presentation, we want to hear from you, and we're going to allow some time to go around and look at these boards. We're going to have staff at each of the boards to answer questions and receive feedback. And there are illustrations on both sides, and we've got to kind of set up as you're walking around Washington Street, so you can start at one end or you can start in the middle, whatever you want. Finally, we'll reconvene around 8 o'clock or so for some final thoughts and some comments and questions. I hope to have everyone out in time for the third inning of the Red Sox game. I don't know. We'll see. But that's the goal. After tonight, the draft vision plan and draft zoning will be uploaded online. I think Lily will talk about that in just a second after Russ. We really appreciate your taking the time both tonight and in the future to share with us your thoughts. Finally, we on the planning team recognize these are really important decisions for the city. There are really strong opinions about Washington Street and what it should look like. We do ask that you strive to be concise and respectful. There's a lot of folks here tonight, and constructive in terms of your comments this evening, but we look forward to them. So without any further ado, I'll introduce Russ Preston to take us through the presentation.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Barney. Everyone from the team, thanks for all the help the last couple weeks to bring all of this together for you tonight. We're actually, I'm going to move this. I feel like a stand-up comedian. We're actually still processing. And what does that mean? So we're actually testing ideas that we got from you all during the design week and starting to really sort of see how can those affect the future of Washington Street. So as Barney said, a lot of these images you see around the boards are hypothetical ideas of what could happen when development occurs. And how can you, by design, shape that development now through zoning? And I think that's really important because we already heard some people are confused about the drawings. The city's not taking down any houses. The city's not ripping down any of these buildings. These are meant to show you what a possible future might be for you in 10, 20, 30 years. So that you can look at them, think about them. And then what's really important is, I was sitting in the coffee shop in Newtonville a couple weeks ago and overheard a couple gentlemen talking about, oh, I think that building's for sale, and I think, what are they going to do with it? And, and they were kind of having a conversation about the future of Newtonville and that site in particular. And I think that's what I want from you all tonight, is to be inspired or be conflicted or start to have a dialogue with the neighbor that you're sitting next to or the other citizens that you might not know, and look at these drawings and start to have a conversation. Because I think what we need from you tonight, and why we've put these types of drawings up with these sites, is what direction do we go in? And what direction do you as a community feel is best for the future of Newton? So my presentation tonight is really just to orient you all to the thinking that we've been doing that informs these drawings. And we've done this with a number of communities around New England, but it's all about this idea of you have to love your neighborhood. And I think you all love Washington Street. You all really enjoy these villages. So the challenge here is, how do we, and you all can't see, can you? So I'll try and back up a little. The challenge here is really, how do you allow this to remain Newton? And how do you allow it to also evolve as the changing demographics and the changing needs of your population evolve? And for us, it's, well, how does that happen? So you've given us a lot of feedback, and it's, some of it is very clear. This type of development is something you don't see in the future for Washington Street. And then, a lot of these types of images, this is actually Beacon Hill. Those were things you really enjoyed. And that started this real tension for us about the scale of development, not necessarily the density or the type of use that's in it, but just the scale. Is it human scaled or is it automobile scaled? And I'll get into that in more detail. But this, sort of started to make us really think about what makes Newton, what makes these villages important. And for me, it was really starting to understand and trying to become part of what these village centers are, and it's sort of a village life, is the way I've been explaining it. There's a Newtonness to it, something that's, when you scroll through some of the Instagram stream, you can start to get a sense of what people are doing in and around these places. So, we've been thinking about this for almost the better part of a year, and for me, practically daily. And it was really interesting to start to understand, how does development and how does the improvements to public spaces and all of the other tensions that we've discovered in this process affect village life here in Newton. And for me, it's really this sort of snapshot of the story of meeting neighbors or meeting your girlfriend or your boyfriend or your husband or your wife or and enjoying a special moment in the village that you live or you're patroning. But then there's this obvious juxtaposition that happens. All of you have talked to us so much about the importance of the villages, yet this doesn't feel like a village to me. And I think Washington Street is a huge opportunity for you to actually make your villages even better and make this section of Newton feel more like Newton. So our work together, I'm thrilled that you all came out tonight. I don't want to talk long because I actually want to hear from you and get you to really tell us what you're thinking when you look at these drawings. But our process, and this is a messy slide because we're still kind of in a messy part of the process. There's a lot of tensions here. And for us, it's about how do we start to find clarity around more and more of these ideas. And just to give you, one tension, don't make the traffic worse, but make Washington Street more friendly for kids and seniors. So there's a tension there. How do you make a place for people, but then how do you not disrupt traffic or change traffic? So these tensions we're futzing with. We're stumbling over some of these because we need more input from you all. We need your ideas and your brains to help us solve some of these problems. And as we get closer and closer to balancing these, that vision will become clearer and clearer for us all. But what's emerged is certainly some shared goals, and this is a big one of them. You're in a good position as a city. It's a beautiful city. Driving around with the fall leaves, these last couple weeks, it's been gorgeous. So you have these great things. You need to demand better development so that it fits in with Newton. And that also goes with your streetscapes. And there's a great expense to be paid to actually improve streets and improve those infrastructure. But you all are right now custodians of this city. And making those investments for future generations is really how you can set up Newton and Washington Street to be a more productive place going forward for 100 years. And that really starts with safety. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. But everyone we've heard, is not feeling like Washington Street is that pleasant to be in sometimes. And then this is both a shared goal, but also a point of tension. And I think we should talk about that more. And really, at the end of the day, anything that comes along needs to be beneficial so that the city still remains resilient. So for us, it's really if and when new development happens, what will it look like? Now, will development occur, but what if it comes and it's proposed, you get an opportunity right now to choose how to guide that. And development is something that, follows a series of steps and a series of instructions. We're writing those instructions right now based on what this vision plan will create. So you have a lot of pressure in Newton, and I think that is reflected in just some of these news clippings. Now's an opportunity to get ahead of that pressure here at Washington Street and start to guide it. So that's what we want your help with right now. We know it's not this, and I want to talk about this because this is something that's very emblematic of a problem throughout New England and the country right now, is that these sort of jumbo buildings. This is actually vertical sprawl. Is everyone familiar with that word, sprawl? It's placeless, it's auto-oriented, it's not friendly to humans. And people, I think, is really what Newton is about. Newton's for people and for people to come to your villages, whether you live there, work there, or just visiting. And looking around, the mayor actually brought me some photos and said, why can't we do stuff like this? Why can't new development look like this? And this is a question that we've been really, really digging into. And I want to show you why this is so hard to do. This tension, this and this are both housing, but one is also trying to house cars as well as people. And I think that's the big distinction. And this gets to a lot of other, this ripples out to how your villages function right now. So if you're going to have new development, and when you have new development, you need to make a choice now about how cars and how mobility, how people get around and interact with the villages, actually connect to that development. So this is a typical situation that you might have now along Washington Street. Someone comes along and buys up all those lots. They make one big lot. That one big lot is what most real estate efforts are trying to do right now in the Boston region. Bigger lots, bigger buildings, more economies of scale. So what happens? In a place like Washington Street right now, you need at least one car for a residential unit, maybe two. The retail requires some parking. The surprising one is an office user, we've heard, wants at least 3 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet of office space. So what does that mean? That means that for 1,000 square feet of office space, you're building 1,050 square feet of car space. So that means you're having a bigger parking facility than an office facility. So that's what that looks like. That's the parking garage in the center of that new lot. But no one likes looking at parking. So we line it on the ground floor with retail, and then we build the stuff, whether it's office or housing, above. And this is sort of masquerading as a building. It's really just sort of house dressing for a parking structure. And this is why these buildings look like that. This is, a parking bay is 60 feet wide. Car spaces are only 9 to 10 feet wide. You have to get columns. So these all are set up on the scale of an automobile, quite literally. So is there another way? And this was the challenge that the mayor brought to me with these photos. And I said, yes, there is. We just forgot how to do this around the 1950s. Funny enough, around the same time that Newton was battling the state DOT for putting the turnpike extension into Boston, was around the same time that we forgot how to do what I'm about to show you. So rather than having one big lot, you could actually subdivide that back into human-scaled parcels. So you end up with a lane or an alley with parking in the center, and building lots like you would find in historic parts of Newton already. And then there are some realities around parking. So you can scale, some of these buildings will be of a scale that they could put basement parking in. And we've seen this, and we've been involved with projects that do this, where we have a small ramp off the lane and parking in the basement. And then you get traditional fabric. And that word fabric is important. You know, it's the weaving together of different buildings, different characters that come together because of the different heights, and the nuances of different floor lines. You know, these might all be 5-story buildings, but they don't feel like 5-story buildings. Some might be 3-story, some might be 6-story. And the reality is this actually results in more people living here. You have less cars, you have more people. And you have this, you know, this, what I would say is village life. You have the street, the lane, the central block that might be a little sort of informal playground. This sets you up for success because this is the way us as humans have been building these settlements we call cities and villages and towns since the advent of agriculture. So this is what those places look like. And these are all new. These have all been built new in the last 20 years. So people are doing this, and this form of development is being resurrected. But okay, so how do you do that if you don't have good transit and you're not ready to make really, really open parking policies? There's something that we sort of is a hybrid, and we've been calling this the courtyard option, and I'll show you why in a second. But essentially, you build an underground garage, a common garage on that whole block. So rather than putting that above ground, you make it go underground. What that allows you to do is you can build a platform that allows different types of buildings to go on top of that garage. And you have one common entrance for the parking. Looks fairly similar to the incremental approach, right? So the differences here are that these buildings are all set up to plug in to that parking grid, that grid of parking spaces below. But you can actually achieve a character that's reminiscent of how we have built cities for millennia. And that's this small increment, this scale, you know, that's more humane and less about the automobile. And these projects are getting built too. This is one of those projects. All of these buildings sit on top of parking that's accessed through stairs near these courtyards. And this concept is a way to actually get human-scaled architecture but deal with the realities of contemporary automobile ownership. These are also happening in much more mixed-use areas. This is a similar project using this same courtyard typology. So there are some pros and cons to each of these. There's pluses and minuses. Right now, the sort of market-driven approach is what we're seeing being deployed in other parts of this region, and is starting to look like it's coming towards Newton. So the incremental option is one that would really set you up for success, but the small scale projects are more costly. There's more elevators, there's more stairs, there's more there's more issues around these actually being desirable places. And then the courtyard is one that might be a likely compromise that we could look at further. So right now, you know, looking at that idea of how do we actually do village scale architecture and use that to start to inform how places evolve in and around Washington Street. So we've looked at the corridor a number of different ways. And this map is particularly important because it kind of is what we call a sector map. And what's important here is these areas in green, you know, we really want to make sure that they are cared for and change very little, if at all. These areas in red, those are places that through the input you've already given us don't really conform to a vision that you might have. These are places that we either know you don't really enjoy being there, or they could become better parts of Newton. And then the blue is really where the village, the cores of the villages and the edges of the villages. So just to dive in a little bit deeper, preserving the scale of neighborhoods, what does that mean? This is the scale of the neighborhoods. This is the scale it should remain. These are really wonderful places. These are really wonderful buildings. There are some places that could, help, have a little help, get a little cleaned up. There are, what's going to happen to the Beacon Hill Athletic Club site. There's places along these sections of Washington Street that might see change, but what we want is for that change to be indistinguishable from the character that's there, so that you walk down the street and you don't even know that's a new building. And this is a new building that's actually a 10-unit apartment building. So the idea that you can preserve and really enhance that part of the neighborhood by not letting it change over time. So then the next is enhancing the quality of the village centers. And what does enhance mean? You have great things about the village centers already, but boy, do they change quickly. When you leave, after you have lunch and have some good barbecue and you turn around, you don't even want to cross the street. So there's some incongruity there that we want to fix. And that's really what this area is about, is how can we start to make those places that are very close, super, super close to the villages that you know and love, even better. And it's amazing to look back at all these historic photos of these places and the buildings that were torn down and the buildings that were lost. And that starts to sort of come back to this idea of these places were scaled based on the human, based on for people. So how do we sort of just look back to look forward? And it's this sort of back and forth between lovely architecture, very cared for places, and then sort of forgotten places that are sort of byproducts of the highway. So, and then this leads to where you might find the most economic impact and benefit to the city, as well as where you might actually put more stuff. And it could be office, it could be residential, it could be retail, and those are in the areas at the edges. And there's an opportunity here that we've been talking about with the team, which is really around these train stations. And what we've found through doing some really deep research on this is a good chunk of these new MBTA commuter rail stops and subway stops even are being done through public-private partnerships. And they're being pulled together because of many different stakeholders in the process know they need a new station. So I think this is a real key to the success. The question is what other benefits come with transit access? And I think a big one is being able to talk about Washington Street as a place that's not just for getting through Newton, but a place where people come to work here, and a place where people, if they want to age in the community, meaning they can't drive any longer or they can't walk to their neighborhood center, they might want to be able to move into a home or an apartment or a condo or a townhouse here, where they don't have to drive and they can get on the bus or they can get on the train. So there's this really important thing about that idea, though, because that requires density. That requires someone, who's aging to be able to walk downstairs and go pick up their prescription or go to the coffee shop or the restaurant. So for us, it's about how do we enhance that lifestyle that you all love about Newton, and then make sure the development or the building efforts, both infrastructure, streets and stations, as well as what might happen on private development, supports this idea of improving the village life of Newton. And these sites were in particularly important because of market pressures, because of things you told us, and because of their proximity to the trains. So very quickly now, because these are on the boards and you'll have a lot of opportunities to talk to us one-on-one or in small groups to look at these, but just to orient you, this is sort of the heart of West Newton as we've heard from you, this sort of interesting collection of small shops, the West Newton Cinema, and the scale really picks up on this idea of village life. And then, I've been going to the La Roma a lot for coffee and realizing that it's quite a spot for people. It's the third place in my mind. I think I see a lot of heads nodding. But it's really kind of a bummer. You got to kind of walk through this parking lot. And I kept on thinking, well, this is interesting. You know, this is a unique set of circumstances where this business is here, and it has this great little shared space in the center of the block. And this sort of led us down the thinking of how can we actually make this even more fine-grained, even more human-scaled. And as historically, when you look at those traditions of building cities and building villages, the closer you got to the center of a place, that place that had the most gravity, the most sort of human care, it got very small blocks. You know, buildings got, you know, tinier and less. It was less about what the buildings were and more about what people were doing in the spaces. So this is the sort of market-driven approach. There's the parking that we talked about. Here's the sort of liner of the parking. And this could, you know, this is a few different buildings coming in. You know, so I'm pretty confident you don't want that. So here's the courtyard option. You know, and this looks at like a more sensitive approach to development on this site. You know, where it tries to sort of keep a very sort of funky, very interesting streetscape, some one-story, some setbacks, you know, trying to preserve some of the smaller storefronts, and then looking at really formalizing an internal courtyard and some interesting public spaces, and placing some of the development next to the highway, trying to use that to buffer the highway. And then this last example is the incremental option. And this is really what happens if you really had no parking requirements, you really lowered the bar for this type of development, meaning maybe by right, and you allowed folks to come in and build buildings that kept historic buildings. That's the police annex. That's new development next to the police annex. So you could take a real sensitive approach to this block and still have this interesting collection of sort of lanes coming into a central courtyard and, you know, a driveway coming out, and then, you know, having a rear parking here, so that you could have a sort of the balanced approach to the proximity to the highway, as well as trying to care for these businesses. And jumping back, you know, it was really interesting to talk to the operators of the West Newton Cinema and to really think about all the arts and culture that are in Newton, and the idea of like maybe bringing all of that together as a cultural center at West Newton Cinema, and thinking interestingly about how that could help shape an identity of one of these courtyards or alleys. You know, and these spaces are wonderful when you get them right. And I think Newton, you know, could demand that developers and builders get them right. So then, on the other end, Craft Street is, you know, something that's really interesting because a number of you have told us that you love Whole Foods, but a number of you told us you never like to walk around that area. You know, so it's not adding to this village life. You go there and shop, and we all do, but it's really sort of a, you know, a bummer part of Washington Street. And you've told us that, so how do we improve that? You know, it's also interesting, you know, there is some office there. There's businesses there. You know, and everyone, you know, sort of has to remember that's the train station right there. It doesn't feel like it's that close when you walk around there today because it's so vast. There's so much parking. There's not a lot of trees, so it feels far away. But the reality is that's like less than a 5-minute walk. You know, it's maybe 2.5, 3-minute walk. So under this sort of market-driven approach, you know, someone could come in and phase in a series of mixed-use blocks. These would be big buildings, wrapping parking. These would be private courtyards. You know, there's the parking structure. You know, this is the type of development pattern that we see when folks are not given very clear direction about what type of development we want. Or there's we want lots of open space, we want lots of community benefit, we want lots of housing at various price points and options. And this is looking at the courtyard. You know, how can we put all the parking underground, create a brand new neighborhood park, you know, to improve the siting of your existing office building, be a gateway into the neighborhood here, also a buffer from the residential neighborhood to what could be a mixed-use train-adjacent development that would allow for either office or residential, as well as a variety of other uses. And then looking at setting up this area of Washington Street as really a new destination, a new neighborhood center, And by doing that and allowing these parcels along the highway to redevelop, that helps to buffer the neighborhood from the highway as well. Or there's the incremental, is that you let this subdivide into smaller buildings, has far less parking, has far less intense development uses, and would have a scale that might be mixed, with smaller apartment houses, townhomes or duplexes, larger apartment buildings that might have parking below in their basement, and then really being sophisticated about intersecting the streets to connect to the surrounding neighborhoods, but not necessarily have any large park or any large public space. So how do we do that? That's the big question. So we need your input now, because some of these discussions are going to lead to zoning decisions. And there's a toolkit that we've been starting to assemble about how do you make the architecture that might come to Newton really feel like Newton and really support that village life. And it starts with the shop front width. This seems like a really minor detail, but you've all told us that you love your local retailers, you love your local businesses, you really want to promote them staying here. And that part of that's because of the scale. Most of the shops range from 14 feet to maybe 32 to 36 feet. When you start to see the national tenants, they get wider, 40, 55, 60-foot wide storefronts. That's out of scale with your village centers. And that's important. So the zoning might actually make a maximum shop width, not just the storefront, but the actual shop. And that starts to inform the size of those places, the types of tenants that come in, and the costs associated with occupying them. The other is you could go a step further and really require some of those storefronts to be preserved and to build back and build above and to try and keep those businesses in place or keep the sense of that scale on the street. The other is, when you come off of a mixed-use place in one of the village centers, how do you step down and very, elegantly connect to the existing residential neighborhood? And, this is Dunstan Street, and looking at really going from sort of a Washington Street building that has to be right adjacent to the Mass Pike. It's literally across the street from the Mass Pike. And how can that step down very quickly to meet the residential neighborhood? So all these tools can be put into your zoning code. And these can be tools that you can use to guide development. And this one in particular, you can make buildings at the streetscape and also step back higher up. So you kind of balance this character with this scale of development. And then you can require new parks and new squares and new open spaces. And this is a new square along Watertown Street. But this all comes back to really thinking about how you use parking and how you use walking and bicycling and transit and bus. You have to think about these places as dynamic. And that the car right now, I think it's 67 to 69% of you commute by car. And I think, how many people walked here tonight actually? Raise a hand. That's more than I expected. Good job. That was about maybe 30%, so that's about right. But for us, I think that's where it comes down to, is how do the development pattern that you're asking for, this small increment village, scale that supports village life, really work with contemporary automobiling. And this is really the incremental building type. You might have to do that by right. Encourage that type of development first, and then have special permits for other types. So, I think Newton is for people. You all came out tonight because you care for this place. I think you need to continue to care for it. And the best way to do that is through connecting all of these ideas along Washington Street. What occurred to me was that this street actually already has protected bike lanes. These two kids were shocked we were standing there in the sidewalk. This is already functioning as a multimodal corridor. People ride their bike down it, people walk by it, people go to the train on it. It's just a really horrible experience at times for people who are not in their car. And I think that's an important opportunity for us to discuss. And how private development can allow this to happen is a big question. But at the end of the day, it's about safety. And I think you can move forward with improvements to Washington Street now. And that's I think the most important point is don't wait. Start to make improvements to your community now. And when you go to these great places, there are fabulous streets that handle plenty of cars. There are beautiful streets that handle twice as many cars as Washington Street today. So those models exist out there. You have to just trust those traditions of those streets. And by trusting that, we looked at them, and during the design week, we put up this illustration. You came back and told us, no, we don't like that. Where are the protected bike lanes? And that was we heard that from actually a lot of people. So we've gone back to the drawing board and looked at Washington Street again. And this is the existing condition today. This is a future condition. This is a possible design. And what this does is integrates wider sidewalks, both through moving the curb and having a setback on any redevelopment. So you actually get a good 12-foot sidewalk. That's a protected bike lane. This is smart parking, which I'll talk about in a second. And then you have 2 or 3 lanes of travel, depending on where you are in the street. And that's important. There are different ends of the street that require different traffic volumes. And then in some areas on the highway side, you might not have parking, you might have parking, but the idea was that you always have sidewalk and bicycling so that you get this continuous corridor, this continuous green spine running along Washington Street. And the smart parking is what helps do that. This is permeable paving. You've got a lot of gas issues in Washington Street that could be fixed at this time too, but this is sort of a smart paving that allows additional trees to be planted. You are the Garden City, so let's make sure that we have enough trees on Washington Street. And then in the locations that are not adjacent to storefronts, in the more residential districts, you might get more trees and less curbside parking. Because it's very rare I see all of that curbside parking filled up when you're not in the village centers. So what's this? This is what you could go out and do in a month. This is paint, this is potted plants, this is the existing curb location. You could go out and test this idea and see if it works, and then refine and improve the idea. And I think that's how you can start to actually make Washington Street better very quickly. And you'll learn from that. And one of the things that people were concerned about is what happens to all the cars if they're not on Washington Street? Well, that's a good question. Let's make sure that you have a set of tools so that you can traffic calm any of that traffic in the neighborhood streets. And if it might go there are plenty of ways to calm them so they're not misbehaving. The chicane, there's a number of tactics to discourage fast-moving cars in your neighborhoods. And that's just a good practice to do anyways. And this all comes back to this idea, village life. How do we make that better? In both the villages, the neighborhoods, and especially along Washington Street. So you've got some decisions, some tough discussions to have. We want to help you make those. And just looking at this real quickly, those discussions have to be thought of as at eye level, where the humans are. And these drawings get to the idea of, is this a place that has employment, has lots of people living on it, lots of people working there, and becomes a place that is very near to the Newtonville train station and also a destination and otherwise? Or is it slightly less version of that? Or is this just a part of the neighborhood that has a different scale and possibly some retail? And I think these are the things that we're really interested in hearing from you is what do you want your villages to look like when your kids are our age today or when your grandkids are around? And that's really what we're talking about is how do we set ourselves up for success in the future, 20, 30, 50 years from now. So thank you. We want your input. We really need your input. So I hope you have enough energy before the baseball game to give that to us. Here's Lily.
Thank you. Your own home. So you can go to the website, newtonma.gov/Washington Street Vision, and that will have a way for you to leave that up. And I actually have a slide that can show this. This software is a really easy to use platform called City Comment. So you click the document, you can read through it, you can stop there if you'd like. If you want to leave comments directly on the PDF, you'll need to log in with your name and email. And then you simply leave your comment directly on the PDF. You can also have notifications for when other people reply to your comment. So that's one way we're going to be doing the draft plan. We also will have printed versions on reserve at the library and ways for you to write your comments manually there. Last but not least, we are going to have a couple of days with drop-in office hours at City Hall. So these are 3 Thursdays and 1 Monday in November. So the 8th, 15th, 19th, and 29th. I'll leave this up here. From 5, actually that should say from 5 to 6:30 at Newton City Hall. So you can come by and talk to the planning staff about anything that you start to read. So thank you very much, and enjoy what you look at.